I'm excited for this season of Rocket Motivation because my firm, Hand, Arundel, Harris & Sale, Attorneys at Law, where I am a partner, is our sponsor. We understand life and running a business can be challenging, but with the right support, it can also be incredibly rewarding. That's why we're thrilled to announce our partnership with Hand, Arundel, Harris & Sale.
What I found out, though, in addressing the issues we were trying to address is that we had far more in common than difference. And if we found those things that we had in common, we can make progress. We wouldn't necessarily have to agree on everything, but we could agree on the many things that we really had common ground. I realized that in practicing law, in being on the bench, that as human beings, we have far more in common, and that we should seek the common ground. And then on those things we differ on, we can differ and still respect the other point of view.
Hey everyone, this is Rod Cate and welcome to Rocket Motivation Podcast. This week's guest was a member of the first class of African American students admitted to the University of Alabama Law School. He began practicing law in 1974. He was a circuit court judge in Tuscaloosa County and was a justice on the Alabama Supreme Court. He served 27 years on the judicial bench. He has been a trustee at the University of Alabama for over 20 years. We could spend the next 30 minutes talking about this week's guest's accomplishments, but his insights, advice, and life lessons are invaluable, and that's what we're going to focus on. It's going to be a great episode. Judge John England Jr., welcome to Rocket Motivation.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, well, Judge, tell us kind of where you are in your life now, where you live, what you do, your family, kind of just catch us all up.
Well, I retired from the circuit court bench in January of 2021, and then my term on the UA Board of Trustees ended in September of 2021. So I am retired from those roles. Now I still do some mediations, not a whole lot, but I still do some mediations. I preside over what we call Second Chance Court here in Tuscaloosa, which meets about once, sometimes twice a week. I teach a class, undergrad criminal law class at the University of Alabama. And after I left the University Board of Trustees, my alma mater, Tuskegee University, asked me to serve on that board. And so the governor appointed me to that board. And so I'm actually serving on the Tuskegee Board of Trustees, where I went to undergrad school. I went to, law school at the University of Alabama. I guess I'm used to being busy. And right now I'm battling with, not doing too much and enjoying my retirement.
Well, so Judge, it sounds like you've retired from the bench, but you haven't retired from doing a lot of stuff.
Well, it keeps me going, and I like to keep going.
Yeah. And Judge, and tell us about your family. I think, especially your children. Now, all three of them graduated from the University of Alabama Law School, didn't they?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, my oldest son is a federal U.S. magistrate in Jefferson. Well, I say Jefferson County, but it's actually the Northern District, because he actually lives in Huntsville, but he spends a good bit of his time in Birmingham. My daughter works with a group called Black Voters Matter in Atlanta, and she's the attorney office manager of that organization, and is, in my opinion, the best lawyer among all of my family. Mm-hmm. And then my son, my youngest son, Chris, is a state legislator who's been in the legislature now since 2006. He is also a assistant city attorney for the city of Tuscaloosa. And yes, they all graduated from Alabama Law School, but now Chris, the youngest, went to Howard undergrad. April went to UAB, and then John, the oldest, attended the University of Alabama.
Right.
And I'm very proud of them, and heck, I spend a lot of time talking about them because I'm proud of what they've tried to do with both their life and with their family, and then commitment to the community.
Right. Well, Judge, let's go back. Why did you want to become a lawyer?
The truth is, my first thought was to be a chemist like George Washington Carver at Tuskegee. And that's really the reason why I chose to go to Tuskegee, so I could be a chemist like George Washington Carver. However, when I got there, this was in the mid-60s. I was at Tuskegee from 1965 till 1969. And I would consider that the height of the civil rights movement, not only in Alabama, but across the country. And during that time, though I was majoring in chemistry, in a chemistry lab, and I thought I was a pretty good student, I saw the world around me, and I didn't think that I could contribute like I thought I should. You know, I saw coming to Tuskegee, Dr. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Julian Bond, John Lewis. All those individuals came through Tuskegee as a part of the Black Belt and the Civil Rights Movement. And through the encouragement of individuals like that, you know, I decided that I wanted to contribute in my state, Alabama. You know, I was originally born in the Black Belt, where Tuskegee is. So I said to myself, with some encouragement from the faculty there, that I'll go to law school. And I actually winded up going to what's called a CLEO program at Harvard during the summer of my junior year. And I took the LSAT, interviewed with a number of law schools, was recruited by some individual law students, white, from the University of Alabama. And I got accepted, and I decided to go. And that's what I did.
Mm-hmm. Well, Judge, and let me ask you this, because I think a lot of people that are listening to this will find this interesting about what was it like for you being a college student at Tuskegee during this time at the height of the civil rights movement? What was that like?
Well, there were a number of HBCUs, black colleges. There were a number of colleges who engaged in significant student protests. For example, at Tuskegee, when I was there, the student body decided to have a meeting with the Board of Trustees of Tuskegee to try to change some of the policies. At the time, Tuskegee had what we call mandatory ROTC. In other words, you had to go to ROTC. You had to go to chapel every Saturday morning. There was a consideration of having more classes that address problems and concerns that, African Americans had. That was also in the midst of the Black Power movement. And so there were many times when there was temptation to leave college and to actually, be more active in the movement. But my instructors and professors at Tuskegee and some of these civil rights people said, hey, you can serve a whole lot more by not leaving school. And if your wish is to practice law, we need lawyers in Alabama, African-American lawyers in Alabama. So I decided to do that, but at the same time participate in the protests that were going on. Right. So at Tuskegee, we actually, the student leaders actually locked the building, we call it Dorothy Hall, that the trustees were having a meeting in order to force them to have a sit-down meeting with those student leaders. And, that was quite a time, because in the midst of that protest, Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, which had a tremendous impact on not only the protest, but the sadness and the anger on those campuses. And that's the best way I can put it. It was a trying time. Of course, I was in student government at the time, and so I actually came to Alabama when Alabama had its emphasis programs and witnessed circumstances which, though I was invited by the student body president, he took me to dinner or attempted to. When we got to the place to eat, of course, I was told that they were not going to serve me. That embarrassed that student body president. But, we just went and found somewhere else. Yeah. But it's, that's just the kind of thing that just goes down, and you can't let it stop you. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Yeah. Well, and Judge, how was it that, well, first of all, the first class at University of Alabama Law School that admitted African-American students, how many African-American students went in that class with you?
All right, that was in 1969, and there were 8 of us, 8 males, of which 4 eventually graduated. 4 did not make it through graduation. It was probably a class of about 150 to 160 of that number. But now, what was interesting was that was about the number of females who were there too, which is another interesting thing about going to law school in 1969 university.
Mm-hmm. And Judge, I mean, how was it there? You're coming from Tuskegee, so now you're at the University of Alabama Law School. You start off with 8 other African Americans, and everyone else is white. I mean, what was that like getting through the law school?
Well, through I went to high school, elementary school in Birmingham, Jefferson County. And so during that whole time, I never attended a class with a white student or a white professor. At Tuskegee, that changed a little bit. Literally all the students were African American. We did have some white professors. So law school was the first time in any real serious way that I attended classes with white students. And as you can imagine, when the classes first started, the 8 of us would sit together in the middle of the class because we were interacting with each other. But as time passed, there were students who we were able to interact with, and in fact, many became friends. Now, I did my first year, and remember, this is during the Vietnam era. So in my first year, I got a draft notice. They used to, you had an opportunity to get deferred while you were in undergrad, but in law school and graduate school, it was not available. And so I actually spent 1 year there, and then I went into the Army because the draft board heard my plea to let me finish law school, and they decided, well, we'll let you finish the year. So I finished my first year, then I went into the Army and spent 2 years there, came back to Alabama and finished law school. I'll say, interestingly enough, when I went into the Army, I went as an MP. So I actually spent time as a policeman during my time in the Army. And I never went to Vietnam, thank goodness. I spent my whole time in a place called Fort Stewart in Hinesville, Georgia. So, that was my, when I came back, there still were only a few African Americans, but, the circumstances were such that there was much more interaction. There were more women there. In fact, the first African American female came, Sue Thompson. Now, she had a hard time because she felt like an outcast. And even now, when we have programs, we have to convince her to come to bar activities because of her, the difficult time she had as a student. I think for me, having the other African-American males who attended HBCUs and black colleges, we had each other, and she did not have that kind of interaction, along with the individuals we came to know after we spent a little time at the university.
Right. And so, Judge, when you first started practicing law, I think you get out in 74. So what challenges do you face now? I mean, you're a lawyer an African-American lawyer in the state of Alabama. Tell us about, maybe some of the difficulties or challenges that you faced then.
There were no large firms or small firms hiring African-American. And remember, I wanted to practice in the black belt, and there definitely weren't any there. So I, along with that female that I just told you about, and one of the other law students who started when I started, we hung out our shingle and started a firm here in Tuscaloosa called Fort Thompson and England. Obviously, I was the junior member of that firm, but that's what we did. We hung out our shingles here in Tuscaloosa. There had not been any African-American firms here in Tuscaloosa. And so we were the first. And while the community was welcoming us, it was difficult to earn a living, but we did. Ultimately, I stayed on. The Sue Thompson, that was the female lawyer. She went to legal services. And then Booker Ford, who is now deceased, he went to legal services in Dallas County, Selma. I stayed on and brought with me an individual by the name of John Bivens. And together we struggled through it.
And Judge, how was it like, kind of the first time going into to courtrooms and arguing motions and being in front of judges, which I assume back then, I guess, were all the judges in the circuit court, were they all white back then?
All of them were. All the judges in Tuscaloosa Circuit Court were white. All the judges in the black belt area that I practiced in too, like Greene County, Sumter County, Perry County, they were all white. As best as I can recall, I believe that Ralph Cook may have been the first African-American judge in Jefferson County, and I think Kane Kennedy eventually in Mobile. So my first few years in law, I only practiced before white judges. Some treated me just like they treated any other lawyer. Others, it was difficult. Many would call me and my clients by first name. I couldn't tell a judge, hey, don't call me or my client. You don't know them well enough. I couldn't tell them that. But I could insist on my clients calling me Mr. and me calling my clients Mr. And ultimately, some of them, and lawyers, prosecutors, and lawyers on the other side, got the message. And some of that worked itself out. But it was not unusual for me to want to go to the jail to visit a client, and the deputy, the sheriff, or whoever was in charge wanted to know who I was and let me see your identification or bar license. That happened fairly frequently, but eventually that the law enforcement people, as well as the bar and the judges, came to know who I was. It worked itself out.
Right.
That's the best way I put it.
Gotcha.
I was just one of the biggest challenges that John Bivens and I faced is that, in that area where you, like the Black Belt, where you have 75% African Americans, but no African American lawyers, no judges, we decided if a young lawyer wanted to come back home and practice law and possibly even run for office, that they could come in our firm and do that. And as a result, we had a young lawyer in Sumter County by the name of Eddie Hardaway, who came back home, practiced law, and then ultimately became the district judge and the circuit judge. We had a judge by the name of Joe Celeste Petway in Wilcox County, who did the same thing. Richard Osborne and his widow, Lily Osborne, did the same thing. Those were individuals that we were able to help come back home and were able to not only practice law in those areas, but establish residence and run for office.
Right.
So, that was one of the challenges, but it was also something that we could do. Not that we had a great firm that was rolling in the money, but at least they could survive.
Right.
And that's what it was about. Yeah. Survive.
Well, and Judge, tell us about, so I know you were practicing law, and then at some point you get appointed to the bench to be a circuit judge in Tuscaloosa County. Tell us about that. How did that come about?
Well, before after practicing law here for a while, I practiced law here 19 years. During that time, I actually ran for the city council, and I served 8 years on the Tuscaloosa City Council, which gave me an opportunity to know a broader spectrum of individuals. Well, in 1990, a circuit judge, Jerry Baird, decided to retire. Tuscaloosa has a judicial commission. They select 3. Those 3 names are submitted to the governor. He selects the one to serve. So I applied along with a number of other lawyers in 1990, 91, made the final 3, and my name was submitted to Governor Guy Hunt to be considered. I went down, spoke with him, and had what I thought was a good interview. In fact, he told me, he said, I think you'll make a good judge. You should apply next year. I think there'll be a vacancy. Well, of course, I said, Governor, I'd like for you to consider me this time. And he didn't. I knew I wasn't going to get selected. But just like he said, the following year, Judge Joe Coughlin, circuit judge here, retired too. So I applied again, made the final 3. But this time, instead of interviewing with the governor, I interviewed with a patronage committee. And that patronage committee was composed of 7 good citizens, but who happened to be Republican, who asked if I would consider running as a Republican. And I told them I did not think that judges should be running from parties. And so I was not selected. I had tried, and that's all you can do is try. Well, then the third year, 1993, John Carr decided to retire. And so I thought about it and I said, no, I don't think so. I've already tried. It's obvious that Governor Hunt's not going to appoint me, but I was encouraged to do it. So finally I said, well, I'll apply. And I got the final 3 again. This time, between me being nominated among the 3 and the time for the decision to be made, Governor Hunt was convicted and removed from office. And I used to tell people I had nothing to do with that. But at that time, Jim Folsom became the governor. And one of the first things he did as governor was to appoint me to the circuit court bench in 1993. Right. And I've basically been on circuit court bench in the Supreme Court from 93 to 2021.
Right.
So I tell people all the time that life has its ups and downs, and sometimes you just have to wait on the Lord. When you think it's time, it may not be, but you got to be ready. Yeah. And that whole experience taught me that. And ultimately, of course, I had to run for office. And I did run in 1994. And in 1994, I actually became the first African-American to be elected to a countywide office with 50, I even remember the number, 57% of the vote, because many thought that I could not be elected in Tuscaloosa County because the African-American population was about 25%. But that's not what happened. Yeah. And so that's one reason I mentioned about the city council, because that gave me the opportunity to broaden the group of folk that I interacted with and could work with. That's my story.
We haven't even scratched the surface of all your accomplishments, but one thing I want to ask is, Based on your life and everything you've done and everything you've been through and your accomplishments, what have you learned about yourself?
First of all, I guess it started to really crystallize when I served on the Tuskegee City Council. When I served there, that was the first integrated group of city leaders. There were 7 of us. We all came from different backgrounds, different perspectives. What I found out, though, in addressing the issues we were trying to address, is that we had far more in common than differences. And if we found those things that we had in common, we can make progress. We wouldn't necessarily have to agree on everything, but we could agree on the many things that we really had common ground. I realized that in practicing law, in being on the bench, and being with a group of judges and trying to understand that. Then I saw that at work when I spent the time on the Alabama Supreme Court and on the UA Board of Trustees, that as human beings, we have far more in common, and that we should seek the common ground. And then on those things we differ on, we can differ and still respect the other point of view. Now, that's sort of been a guiding principle that I've had. Sometimes that resulted in me not fighting to the end, because I realized that you cannot fight every battle. You got to pick it. So that's sort of been my philosophy about, how to handle and get stuff done and how to work with others who may have a different background or may just be different interests than I have. Most people want to do the right thing. Most people.
And Judge, and kind of broadening that out a little bit, what's your philosophy on life? Or maybe the better question is, what should we want to get out of life?
I'll give you an example of something that happened to me when I was at Tuskegee. I was a family of 6. My father worked at the steel mills, so we were poor. And going to college was not something that was necessarily I was destined to be. My mother and father were determined that I would go. And so I went to Tuskegee. I had a tuition scholarship, had to work the rest of the work in order to be in school. And I went down as a chemist. And I'll never forget, I took my first chemistry exam and did the best I could, got my score back, and it was a 67, which is a D. And I'll never forget, I got it, I looked at it, and I said, all the investment that my parents have put in me, and I'm down here failing. And it was one of the most difficult nights I had in my life. So the next day when we came to class, it turned out that 67 was the highest grade in the class. It was an A. And so from that point on, I never doubted if I did my best, I'd be all right. This whole thing, do your best, the Lord will do the rest. Hey, that was my motto when I campaigned for office, despite what some considered overwhelming odds. If I did my best, I won. Even if I didn't get the most votes, I won if I did my best. That's just been my philosophy about my life and anybody else's.
And Judge, the podcast, the Rocket Motivation podcast that we're doing now, the whole purpose of this podcast is I bring on guests who can talk about, their lives and, struggles they may have gone through. And so but the main thing I want is for guests like you to give advice to others that are going through some tough times or facing adversity. Based on your life, what advice would you give to somebody who's right now listening, having a tough time, trying to get through it? What do you tell them?
I tell them to do their best, have faith in themselves. Don't be afraid to ask questions. It does not mean that you dumb or stupid because you ask questions. As a young lawyer, I figured it out that If you don't know and you don't ask, that makes you dumb. If you ask and get the information, then it gives you a chance to do your best and be your best. I'm not suggesting that one go off half-cocked and say, I'm smarter than any and everybody else. What I suggest is that individuals have confidence in themselves, but understand that if you don't ask, you may never know. I remember in law school, I asked a question in a class, and the professor looked at me and said, "Oh, you don't know that?" And as it turned out, he said to the other class members, "Oh, would you answer that question for me?" No one could, because they didn't know the answer either. They just were afraid that they would be considered dumb and did not seek to answer the question. So that's me.
Well, Judge, I want to thank you so much for coming on. And just so everybody knows, how I know Judge England is after he retired, Judge England mediated a case that I was in, and I had a chance to talk to Judge England and kind of get to know him a little bit, but not that much. But I knew, based upon his history, that he would make a great guest on this podcast. So I asked him to come on, and fortunately for me and for everybody that's listening, he came on. So, Judge, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to do this. But I always give the guest the parting shot, Judge. So if you got some other wisdom, anything, advice, anything, any wisdom you can impart to, kind of take us home, now's the time to do it.
I've talked a lot, and probably I've talked too much. But I guess, when I say we'd be surprised if we looked and we saw and interacted with others and found out how much more we have in common than we're different, it makes it so much easier to live in this world. As you probably can tell, my faith is strong. And that faith is in others and myself. So have faith in others, oneself, and God will bring you through. So that's my last bit of information. Thank you for letting me do this.
Well, thank you for coming on. This has been my pleasure. And thanks again, Judge.
Thank you. Oh, and excuse me for saying this, but roll tide.
Great episode with Judge England. What a life. So honored that he took the time to tell us his life story and provide great nuggets of wisdom and inspiration. Tune in next week for another inspiring episode of Rocket Motivation. Thanks again for listening to Rocket Motivation. I want to again thank our sponsor, my law firm, Hand, Arundel, Harrison Self, with offices in Mobile, Birmingham, Fairhope, and Athens, Alabama, and Destin, Panama City Beach, and Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. We are uniquely situated among the Southeast major law firms to provide legal direction to clients throughout Alabama and Northwest Florida. So whether you're looking for legal advice, litigators, or simply a partner you can trust, Hand, Arundel, Harrison Sale is there for you. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out Hand, Arundel, Harrison Sale for all your legal needs. Visit our website at handfirm.com. And if you would like to get my book, Get Back Up, it's available at Amazon. Just put in Get Back Up and my name, Rod Cate, and the book will pop up. I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to Rocket Motivation wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please rate and review the shows and spread the word about Rocket Motivation to your friends. So until next time, remember, never give up and always get back up.